I am excited about this week. This is actually my favorite passage in Nehemiah. I've really enjoyed studying this week. We're going to be in Nehemiah Chapter 5, so go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Nehemiah Chapter 5. I told the first service that, man, even if this is meaningless to you today, it's still a win because it was really meaningful to me. But I think first service, I think they heard from the Lord. So hopefully you will today too. But if you're familiar with the book of Nehemiah, you may know that Nehemiah is often associated with leadership. A lot of Christian books on leadership refer to Nehemiah and his life and his work, and rightly so, because Nehemiah, he was a great leader, and all throughout the book, he just demonstrates excellent leadership qualities. For instance, Nehemiah was a great communicator. If you read through his speeches, he just had a way with words, a way of inspiring people, a way of motivating them, a way of getting them out and getting them moving. But also, he was a great planner. Remember, he came up with this idea of completing the wall when there was a threat of attack. He said, all right, half of us are going to work on the wall, while the other half of us are going to keep a lookout for attackers, and we're all going to be ready to fight. And if something happens, we're going to be prepared. But all of that probably would have been quite an organizational challenge. But Nehemiah was able to do it, and he did it very well. And then finally, Nehemiah was a courageous soldier. Last week, Gary talked about how he came up with this plan. He said, guys, we're gonna sleep in our clothes. We're gonna have our weapons at our side, and if anything happens, we're gonna be ready. And so Nehemiah, he's courageous, he's organized, and he's this inspiring communicator. But as great as all of those things are, I don't think any of those things are what made Nehemiah such a great leader. I think the passage that we're going to look at today shows us why Nehemiah was such a great leader. And it's odd because in this passage, Nehemiah makes his biggest mistake. And in fact, the mistake that he makes is so big that the people start crying out to God against him, and he almost loses them. But here's the thing. Nehemiah's response to that mistake is inspiring. Okay, and it reveals to me why he was such a good leader. And in this passage, he's going to do two things. First thing he's going to do is he's going to admit that he was wrong. Okay, and that's huge. But then second, once he admits that he's wrong, and once he realizes what the right thing to do is, he is going to commit to doing that right thing, even at great personal cost. And I think those two things are what made Nehemiah such a great leader. Now, like I said, this passage is my favorite in the whole book, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. But part of Nehemiah's journey through all of this is realizing something about God. And it's probably more accurate to say he remembered something about God that he already knew, but he had forgotten. And I think it would be good for us to be reminded of this thing about God that Nehemiah remembered as well. But before we get into the text, I want to set the stage for the story. I mentioned already that the context of all of this is a mistake that Nehemiah made, and I want to take a minute to explain exactly what that mistake was. Now, last week, we saw opposition from our good friends Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. And they were planning a sneak attack against the Jewish people. And so Nehemiah, he comes up with this famous plan. Half of us are going to work on the wall, while the other half keep watch. And if anything happens, we're all going to be ready. We'll be ready for war. So everyone, whether they're building or they're watching, they're ready to fight. But in addition to that, the other part of the plan was at nighttime, he said everybody has to come in to the city within what will eventually be the walls, to sleep there at night. And what this would have done is this would have ensured everyone's safety because it would have concentrated them all into the most fortified part of Jerusalem. Now, as effective as Nehemiah's plan was, it was also very inconvenient. And it wasn't equally as inconvenient for everyone. It affected some of the Israelites more than it affected others. Now, specifically, those people who lived outside the walls were affected way more than those who lived within city limits, because the people who lived outside were going to have to come in and stay in these makeshift arrangements. Now, if you had to guess, what kind of people would you guess lived inside the city versus what kind of people lived outside of the city? Well, the nobles, the wealthier people, and the merchants, they would have all lived inside the city, and the poor farmers would have lived outside of the city walls. And so Nehemiah's policy about everybody coming in to sleep inside the city at night, that would have affected the poor people more than the wealthier people. Farming is an all-day job, and the farmers, they would not have been able to tend the fields while they're working on the wall. But further, it's not like they could have snuck out in the evening or maybe gotten up a little bit early in the morning to work on their farms before hitting the wall. They had to stay the night in the city, and so they're unable to tend to their fields. So this arrangement that Nehemiah came up with it's harder on the farmers than it was on the people who lived in the city. Now further, in an agrarian society, if you're a farmer, you want a lot of kids, okay? Because more kids equals more help around the farm, and more help around the farm means more returns on your crops. But that's assuming that you are there to do the work, right? Because more kids also means more mouths to feed, and when you aren't in the position to work on your fields, this can become a problem. And so, you've got these farmers, and they've got all these kids, all these mouths to feed, but because of the threat from Sanballat and the Samaritans, they don't have the time to put into their fields to make sure their farms don't fail, and their farms are all failing. And because all the farms are failing, there's not enough food to go around, and so there's this famine, and the price of food goes up because there's less food for the same amount of people, and then the farmers are in this situation where food prices are higher, but they don't have as much money. Plus, throughout all of this, Judea, they're still an occupied nation, and they still have to pay taxes to Persia. And we all know the IRS always gets their money. Okay? So what do you do in this situation if you're a farmer? What do you do if you have no money, but your kids need food? What are you going to do? Well, if you're desperate enough, you're going to get kind of the ancient equivalent of a payday loan. And what are you going to use as collateral for that loan? Well, there's only two things that you have that you could use as collateral. You have your land, and you have your kids. Right? The stakes, those are pretty high stakes. And so as you can see, the construction time is extra difficult on the poor people, on the farmers. And we're going to see today that this arrangement caused them significant hardships. And Nehemiah is going to have to face some heartbreaking realities about his rebuilding plan that he came up with. So I think that's enough background that we can get into chapter 5 now and look at the first 5 verses of Nehemiah chapter 5. Now, there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, "With our sons and our daughters we are many. Let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive." And there were also those who said, "We're mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our houses to get grain because of the famine." And there were those who said, "We've borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now, our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, and our children are as their children, and yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved. But it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards." Okay, we'll stop there. So verses 1 through 5, I mean, this paints a pretty grim picture of what is going on in Jerusalem at this time. Nehemiah introduces it with this statement of, this cry arose from the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. And then he goes on to describe exactly what this outcry was. Remember how I described how difficult it would have been for a farmer at this time? They're trying to balance working on the wall by day, and then they've got this farm that they've got to keep up, and it's impossible. And yet, despite this loss of income that they had from having to work on the wall, it didn't relieve any of the tax burden on them. And these taxes at this time would not have been a joke, okay? They would have had to pay 10% to the temple. They would have had to pay another 10% to the Persian Empire, to Artaxerxes. They would have had to pay another 10% to the local government and another 10% to Nehemiah. Okay, so we're talking 40% of their income going to taxes, and they're not even getting like free college education or free healthcare for any of this. Okay? I mean, this is quite a burden on them. How are they supposed to pay for all of this and still support their families? Well, the answer is that they couldn't, but the way they would try to do it is they would take a loan out and put their land down as collateral. And then when they were unable to pay off that loan, they would inevitably lose the land, but they would still live on it and work the land as like tenant farmers, only the profits from their crops would now go to these money lenders, whoever owned the land at this point. And then what would happen next is when they got desperate again, they had to take out another loan, only this time they would have to use their children as collateral. And the text says, we're losing our kids to debt slavery. So you can imagine, I mean, you understand now like why the people are so unhappy with Nehemiah. Okay, I mean, I can't imagine this, but it gets worse, right? It gets worse because the people specifically mention, they say, our kids are being sold as slaves and our daughters have already been sold. They specifically mention the daughters being enslaved. And this probably means being married off to somebody as like a second wife for money to pay off a debt. Okay? Now, polygamy was practiced in the ancient world. And when it was, there usually was kind of like a hierarchy among the wives. And so the first wife was kind of the most honored, the head of the pecking order, and her kids would have been the heirs. And then subsequent wives wouldn't have been honored as much. You think of the story of Jacob with Rachel and Leah, and it mentions specifically that Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. And you think of like who Jacob's favorite sons were. He played favoritism. Remember, it was Joseph at first. That's Rachel's oldest son. And then when Joseph was gone, it became Benjamin, her younger son. And actually, this story in the ancient world, it would have been shocking, but not for the reason that you think. Okay, the ancients would not have been surprised that Jacob showed favoritism. What they would have been surprised at was that his favorite was actually his second wife, Rachel, because remember, he had been tricked, and Leah was actually his first wife. Now, the Mosaic law, it actually allowed for polygamy, but it said if you did have two wives, that you were not allowed to show favoritism. That was against the law. But we can tell from some of the Bible stories, and the fact that they even had to have a law against it shows that it happened. Now, you may be wondering at this point, like, why did God allow for polygamy in the Mosaic law? And I don't really know the answer to that. I do know that the New Testament prohibits it. Jesus prohibited polygamy when he said, no man can serve two masters. Okay, that was a joke. You can laugh. Yeah. Some of you will get it later. No, but seriously though, Jesus' plan, he says that God's plan for marriage had always been one man, one woman, and I don't know why he allowed for concessions for polygamy in the Mosaic law. I suspect it was because there was far more eligible more eligible women than there were men. The men usually waited till they were in their 30s, so they were old enough to support a family before they got married. But this required them to survive the military experience. All the fighting was done by the young men, and we're talking hand-to-hand combat, no modern medicine or anything like that. So you were fortunate to survive into your 30s if you did, and you were old enough to get married. The women married much younger, and so I suspect it was because you had far more eligible women than you did men that this is why it was allowed. I don't know for sure, but that's my best guess. But for our purposes, the point is, even in a period where this kind of thing went on, this is not what you wanted for your daughter. Okay, even the ancients, when they were familiar with this kind of thing, this was not what they wanted for their daughters. But they're losing their daughters as second wives to people, and they're losing their sons to debt slavery. I mean, I just can't even imagine that. And so you can understand why there's such an outcry of the people against the folks that are responsible for this situation. And we see their pain in verse 5 when they're talking to these brothers of theirs, the moneylenders, and they say, man, our kids are just like your kids. Okay, we're supposed to be brothers here. Our flesh is as your flesh. Our kids are like your kids. Our kids go to school together. They play baseball together. And, we're supposed to be working on this wall together. This is all supposed to benefit all of us. And yet, because we're poor and we can't afford to work on the wall and feed our families, we're losing our kids to slavery. Right? This whole situation is awful. But fortunately for Israel, Israel's leader at this point is a good man. And he hears the outcry of the poor, and he acts. And of all the things that Nehemiah does in the entire book, what he does here is my favorite. So let's look at verses 6 through 11, see how he responds. He says, I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. And I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials, and I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. And I held a great assembly against them, and I said to them, we, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations. But you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us. And they were silent, and they couldn't think of a word to say. And so I said, the thing that you're doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations of our enemies? Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you may have been exacting from them. Okay, let's pause for a second there. All right, Nehemiah, he hears the outcry of the poor, and it just made him very angry. And you don't want to see him when he's angry. But what he does next was the ancient Israelite version of taking the wealthy people to court. Okay, when it says that he brought the assembly together, he brings this assembly, he's doing this to make accusations against them, against the nobles. These are legal accusations. That's what court looked like in the ancient world. And the case against them is that they have illegally charged interest when they lent money to the poor. The Mosaic law stipulated that for a Jewish person to lend money to another Jewish person, they were not allowed to charge interest. But the wealthy people were breaking that law. And Nehemiah says, guys, this isn't right. It's got to stop. But I love what Nehemiah does in these verses. You look at each little individual response that he has. I think it gives us great insight to Nehemiah's character. The first thing that he does, and this is easy to miss when you read through it. First thing is, verse 10, he admits that he was part of the problem. Verse 10, he says, moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. He says, I was doing it too. He doesn't deny responsibility. He doesn't act holier than thou. He doesn't make excuses and pretend that his role maybe wasn't as significant as some of the other people's. He just comes out and he says, look, I was doing it too. And second, he also says, let's not do this anymore. Let's stop. Okay, he commits to changing. He said, this thing that we've been doing, it ends today. And then finally, and this is, I think, my favorite thing that he does, is verse 8 says that he goes out and he buys back all of these kids that have been lost to slavery with his own money. And unless we forget the significance of that act, let's remember that Nehemiah is a eunuch. And so here's a guy who will never experience the joy of holding his own son or his own daughter in his arms ever. He'll never experience that. He goes out and he buys back all the sons and daughters of the people of Israel. And I love that. Nehemiah confessed. He apologized. He committed to doing the right thing. He said, guys, this is over. We're not going to do this anymore. And then lastly, he made things right. He went out and he made things right. Imagine if every leader did that when they messed up. I really, really, really like what Nehemiah did here. And it shows us what kind of man he is. He was a man who he knew himself. He didn't feel like he had to deny responsibility. He didn't feel like he had to be perfect. He wasn't like the thought that he did something wrong didn't just make him panic. So he was like, how do I spin this so that people don't think I did something wrong? He didn't do that. He came out and he admitted it. But at the same time, he was a man of conviction, and he wanted to do the right thing. So it's not like he just said, okay, guys, I apologized. Now you have to forgive me. He didn't play that card either. No, he went out and he did the hard things that he needed to do to make things right and to earn back the people's trust and to earn the right to lead again. And so Nehemiah shows me in this passage that he's a leader worth following, and the people saw that too. Now, what changed in Nehemiah? What was it that went through his head, changed his thinking about this whole thing? Because he had been part of the problem. What changed to make him call for the nobles to stop this practice of lending with interest? Well, there's a word that occurs 4 times in these 6 verses. It's in verse 7, it's in verse 8 twice, and it's verse 10 once. And I think it gives us a clue. And that word is brother. I think it finally hit Nehemiah that these people were his brothers. Anybody who knows anything about the Bible knows that God cares for the poor and knows that God calls his people to care for the poor. Well, Nehemiah and the other nobles, in a way, they were helping the poor. They're offering the poor loans so that they could pay their taxes, and in a way, that was helping. But there's a danger when we work with the poor, and that is to start thinking that we are different than the poor, that they're different than ourselves. And if we don't fight against that tendency, we can start thinking of the poor as a category different than who we are. So we have, here's the poor here, and they lack resources because they make bad decisions, and they value things that are ultimately worthless, and they have bad habits. And then, well, here's us, and we have resources that we've earned because we make good decisions, and we have good habits, and we value things that are ultimately worthwhile, things that matter. And when you start to think of the poor as different than yourself, then you can start to think of yourself as kind of a messiah for helping them. So you start thinking things like, these poor people, who knows what they would do if left to themselves? It's a good thing they have me here to help them. It's a good thing I'm here to help them. And when you get into that messianic mindset, that the poor are different than you and that they're lucky to have you to help them, then you can start justifying the ways that you mistreat them. And I think that's where Nehemiah and the other nobles were. I think they knew it was against the law to lend to other Israelites with interest, but they found ways to justify it anyway. And I think they were thinking things like, well, I'm lending them this money so they can pay their taxes, and I'm going to be far more kind to them than Artaxerxes would be. So, it's kind of a win-win for both of us. Besides, the interest rate is fair. It's what I would charge anyone. And so when we get in this mindset that the poor are different and that they're lucky to have our help, it makes it easy for us to start justifying the ways that we mistreat them. Now, fortunately, Nehemiah realized his mistake, and he changed. The cries of the poor reached his ears, and for the first time, he saw the poor as his brothers. He saw the poor not as somebody different than him, but as his brother. And suddenly, when he realized that, his behavior was tougher to justify. And so he said to the other nobles, he's like, guys, what we're doing is not right, and this needs to stop today. So let's look at their response. This is how the nobles respond to Nehemiah, starting in verse 12. Then they said, we will restore these things and require nothing from them. We'll do as you say. And then Nehemiah says, and I called the priests, and I made them swear to do as they promised. And I also shook out the fold of my garment, and I said, so may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep his promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied. And the assembly said, amen. And they praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. Okay, so inspired by Nehemiah's example, the other nobles, they agree. They're like, okay, we're gonna give back everything that we've defrauded them from the poor, and we're gonna stop, doing this predatory lending. We're no longer gonna charge them interest. And Nehemiah's actions inspired the other nobles to act. Now, as inspiring as what Nehemiah has done already in buying back the people's kids that they lost to slavery, he's not done yet. He's going to take it one step further. Now, Nehemiah, he's in a little bit awkward of a situation here because he is paid, or he's entitled to this massive food allowance for doing the job that he did. Remember, he works for the Persian Empire, and so his pay basically comes from the taxes levied against the people, and yet these taxes are what causing the problem in the first place. And so he's in a little bit of this awkward situation. So let's see how he responds to that in verses 14 through 19. He says, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. I also persevered in the work on this wall, and we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came up to us from the nations that were around us. Now what was prepared at my expense for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. And yet for all of this, I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people. So Nehemiah goes above and beyond. All right, he's so struck by brotherhood with the other Jewish people and by the fear of God that he turns down this massive food allowance that he was in, that his position warranted. As governor of Judea, he would have been entitled as part of his pay, this food allowance, as part of his compensation. But he realized that if he accepted this, then he was becoming part of this system that was oppressing the poor. And so he says every day, there was 150 people besides any visitors that we might have at the time. So 150 people that ate at my table every day, he says, at my own expense. He refused to take the allowance. Think about that. Rather than perpetuating the system that was hurting the poor, he chose to give. He was a changed man. Now, there are a ton of lessons that we can learn in this passage. On the one hand, there's a very strong message about poverty and God's care for the poor and our brotherhood with the poor. And this is the lesson that Nehemiah learned. Like Nehemiah learned that the poor are my brothers and sisters. God is their father. And I think that's an important part of the message of this passage. But I don't think it's the main point of the passage. Because every time I read it, and every time I looked over it and tried to read it from different angles, and what if we read it like this, what if we read it like that, every time, the thing that stuck out to me the most is Nehemiah's example. Everything, I think, just comes back to Nehemiah and his character. Yes, the theology of the poor is there, and it's important, but more than anything, I was struck by Nehemiah's behavior when he realized that he was part of the system that was exploiting the poor. He wasn't afraid to admit that he was wrong, and he wasn't afraid to change. And I think that's an important life lesson, one that's hard to learn, but one that we need to. Now, you may never find yourself in a position where you can exploit the poor through predatory lending. But you will inevitably find yourself in a situation when you're doing something wrong and people confront you to change. And I think Nehemiah gives us a good example of a model of how to do that. He admitted that he was wrong. He apologized. He committed to change. And he made things right. And I think that's a great model. I once heard Chuck Swindoll say, "It's never too late to stop doing what is wrong and start doing what is right." And for some reason that stuck out to me. I love that. I'll never forget it. You are not pot committed to any kind of behavior in your life. Okay, you can always change. The Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians 3, 9 through 10, "You have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." And I love that because on the one hand, Paul has this one-time transaction thing. He's like, you've put off the old self, you've put on the new self. Like that's a one-time thing. It's about coming to faith in Christ. But then he goes on, he says, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of his creator. That's a process, right? In Christ, we're always in the process of being renewed. In his rule, St. Benedict said, always we begin again. Always we begin again. And so as we move to our time of response, I want us to reflect on that. Because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, God is at work in your life, and he's renewing you. He's renewing you. And that means always we begin again. Now, God isn't renewing you to make you acceptable in his eyes. He's renewing you because in Christ, you already are acceptable to him. And so now as the band comes back up, we're going to sing 2 more songs. And while we sing, we're also going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. This is your first time here and you're wondering how in the world is all this going to work. You're free to come up at any time or you're free not to. If you just want to stay where you are, you can do that. You can worship